there were quite a number of organizations throughout the U.S. Submitted comments, and I think they were able to get over 100,000 citizens to sign on to these comments. And this was basically telling the agencies that the consolidated framework is broken and that the way we regulate products of biotechnology or products of genetic engineering is insufficient and that adequate regulations are needed for these products. So I think that's an important thing. The assessment that there's no risk here. Although if you actually read the EFSA response carefully, what they're saying is, well, there's no evidence that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient, is probably safe. But they said they didn't have data or the company didn't submit sufficient data on the potential toxicity of the other things that make up the actual herbicide that's used. Because the
Exactly.
products that's actually sprayed in the field has what are called the active ingredients, and those are the ones that are deliberately put in there to do a given function, in this case, to kill weeds. Now, what the other things that are in there, there can be things that, for example, helps the herbicide to stick to the plant or to penetrate into the plant more readily, or these other functions. Those, unfortunately, legally are termed inert ingredients. But the term inert, which people think means doesn't have any um,
Misleading.
yeah, doesn't have any impact is not true. All it means legally is that those compounds are not deliberately added for the given function, that is, this herbicidal function.
So,
So
what are
anything
those
else that's
inert
contaminant,
ingredients, Dr.
right? So,
Hansen? What are they?
well,
They're
those
secret.
are, yes, they are, but actually, a number of them are known. One that is a problem is this surfactant, and that's something that sort of helps the herbicide to stick to the leaves of the plant. That's a substance called POEA, and there's evidence that that's toxic. And actually, part of the reason that we have a difference between what the regulatory agencies say, like EFSA and the Germans and even the US EPA, and what IARC said, is IARC actually looks at all the data, all the studies that are on glyphosate. So that also includes the studies that are done on the formulated product as it's used in the real world, right?
Right, right. So they're looking at
Whereas
that whole Roundup product, not just that one active ingredient. Now, I want to
that's
know
correct.
why aren't all these other people looking at, because that in those inert ingredients are what
Uh,
really scares me.
yes, and but you to put this in its proper context, you have to understand the history of it. What the issue was when you look at pesticides is when the Environmental Protection Agency was set up in 1972, they did decide that we're going to look at all pesticides and try to, come up and set some kind of safe level, try to set some safe tolerance level. Now, when the agency was formed in 1972, they took that task on. The problem that they encountered is when they looked at it, they said at the time, oh, there's 35,000 pesticide products on the market. And what the government said is that's too many. We can't look at the safety of 35,000 products one by one. That'll take forever. So, what they said is given limited resources and because we can't do everything, that's too many. But the active ingredients, the main sort of pesticide or chemical or herbicide in this case, those the active ingredients, there's only about 600 of those. And so the EPA made a decision in 1972, we're going to look at the safety of active ingredients, not of the formulated product. So that means they'd only have 600 to go through rather than 35,000. And this was supposed to take to do all 600 active ingredients that was supposed to take 7 years. They said this would be done in 7 years. So it, would have been 1979, 1980. However, decades later,
Yeah,
we've only
decades
just,
later.
yes, we've only done the first go round of looking at these pesticides. So when you look at it, it does make sense for why the agency, when they first started to look at this, decided we're going to look at active ingredients, right? But the
Yeah.
formulated product, which is the real thing, that can have all sorts of things in it. And in fact, there's been a huge fight in the US over the years to get those inert ingredients made public. That still hasn't happened, but through lawsuits and action taken against EPA, they were able to force them to come out and at least classify them in these broad classes A, B, C, and D. And one class was stuff that was clearly known to be toxic, and those all had to be removed. But as it turned out, there were things that were considered inert ingredients that were like chlorinated rubber, DDT, arsenic, all these things. They were literally, yes.
So slipping
Part
that in there under this inert
No, no,
ingredient.
no. It can be a contaminant. A perfect example is there was a pesticide being used in the 70s and 80s, and I think it's still on the market, called kelthane, and it's an insecticide and a miticide. So you spray it against like mites. Well, it's in the same family. It's an organochlorine, and it turns out when you manufacture it, a side reaction or a contaminant during the manufacture is DDT. Now, what was happening at the time is DDT was
Right.
outlawed in 1972, but what they started noticing in the late 80s and early 90s is the environmentals and DDT is something that is environmentally persistent because it's, bioaccumulates. It, concentrates in fat. And what they noticed is all of a sudden the background levels of DDT in California started to increase, and that didn't make any sense. Since it had been banned in the 70s, and this was happening like in the 90s and the late 80s and 90s. And what they realized was this thing actually had a significant amount of contamination with DDT. But since that was not being deliberately added in there to kill the insects, it was considered just to be a quote inert ingredient. So the clear classes of things that are clearly hazardous, those were yanked from pesticides sometime in the 90s. But there's still hundreds of things that could be in there, and many of them you just don't know what the safety is. And also, there's the problem with chemical mixtures because there actually have been studies done where they take a herbicide that you can buy at a lawn and garden store, which is a mixture of 2,4-D and maybe dicamba, and they can actually do experiments in the lab and show that that's more toxic than if you just look at the active ingredient by
Well,
itself.
isn't that endless duo?
Well, yes, that's an example of endless duo is yes, that's a combination. That's glyphosate and 2,4-D.
And that's approved for use for next spring.
That's correct. But I think the point to back up is that the EPA and the regulatory agencies, they only look at active ingredients. So that means they're asking a very narrow question. Does this active ingredient cause cancer or some kind of adverse health effect? Well, if you have a study on the product that's actually used by people, that is the formulated product, you can't tell if you see toxicity there. You can't say that it's due just to that active ingredient. In fact, you don't know what it is in there that might be causing it, unless you, of course, know the mechanism of action and exactly what it's doing, but usually you don't.
And then what about this, Dr. Hansen? Then, I've went to the actual government websites when I type in, like how much is in how many pesticides are on this apple or how many pesticides are on this potato. And, we're talking like 50 pesticides on one apple, 35 on a potato with the skin on it. And
Well, but those are very extreme numbers. Very few individual pieces of produce, like an individual apple, will have that many.
okay. But
But in terms of having multiple residues, yes, yes, that can easily happen. So there is the issue of these additive effects, right? And so part of the problem that the regulatory agencies, they only look at the active ingredient, they don't look at the full product. So that means there's a lot of studies they ignore, and most of the studies on the active ingredients have actually been done by the companies themselves. Um,
And so you're saying that that's really what we should be upset about are these kind of, these other ingredients that are in there, but they don't have to tell us what they are. We have no clue, but we do have some clue, and that we have found that there have been things that have created chemicals like DDT. And
Right, but what I'm saying, no, what I think the point about this is that the products that are actually on the market, that those are what need to be tested for safety, right? Just because you say a given active ingredient is fine, that's not what people are exposed to. They're exposed to a formulated product. And all I'm saying is that those have not been adequately tested, much less combinations of them.
well, I guess the question that I was really asking before is that we know that there can be multiple pesticides sprayed on a fruit or vegetable during its growing period. And that during, when you're
That's
spraying these different pesticides with these different inert ingredients, that the combination of those inert
can
ingredients,
be
even from
even
one to the other pesticide, are creating a new toxin.
that well, they could interact in ways to enhance the toxicity. So, sort of, they could act in a synergistic fashion so that the toxicity of the whole is greater than what you would normally expect just by adding the individual toxicities together.